So we're going to start one more session of this ERC workshop. The next speaker is my colleague, Jor Wittmer. Although I've been with Jor for the last 8 years together, but I was surprised when I saw his bio. So he's a research professor at IMDEA Networks, and he's the research director of the institute as well. He's mostly working on the wireless network. Well, he's going to be talking about that. He was, before joining us, he was in the manager of the ubiquitous networking research group at Docomo in Munich. And before, he was a postdoctoral researcher at EPFL. He's here because he had an ERC consolidator grant. And after that, he got the Friedrich Wilhelm Bessel Research Award of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, among other fellowships.
Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. I'll be talking about the millimeter wave research that we're doing in my group, which is exactly funded by this ERC Consolidator grant. By now, you've probably seen so many IMDEA people running around that you've heard at least about the institute. My group is about 15 people altogether, and like 70–80% of the group are working on these millimeter wave topics. So, very briefly, what the project is about, like from a very high-level perspective, and then I'll go into the details. So the project started like in 2014, is almost about to run out. And it's about very high frequency communication, so local area networks at millimeter wave frequencies. And why you move to these frequencies is because that's where there's bandwidth available for very high speed communication. At the same time, communication at these frequencies is very challenging. And what we specifically wanted to look at is, well, what will these networks look like? We expect them to be very high density, they'll be extremely dynamic, then how do you deal with these dynamics and so on. So that's sort of the very sort of high level overview of what the project is about. In this talk, I'll go a little bit into a few of like the specific aspects, just to give some concrete examples of what we're actually doing. And for this talk, I've picked the very applied topics, where we really sort of do practical experimental research. We also do some more theoretical work, which I've left out. So millimeter wave communication, by now it's become a very, very hot topic. When I started looking into it, it was much less well known. Now you have a lot of groups working on that. It's extremely appealing. It's surely going to come sooner or later. Because it's simply something where the characteristics are such that if you really want tens of gigabits of dedicated rate per user and you have many users, at lower frequencies it's just not feasible with technologies that we have today. Whereas at millimeter wave frequencies, there's enough bandwidth available that you can actually do that. And current hardware that's on the market already achieves several gigabits per second, faster than anything that you have at low frequencies for wireless communication. What you see on this slide is also one of the main characteristics. What you need at these frequencies are directional antennas, directional communication to achieve reasonable link distances, just because at these very high frequencies also the attenuation is very high. You can't communicate very far. To be able to get like meters, tens of meters of link range, you already need these directional antennas. And that brings a lot of advantages and a lot of disadvantages, and that has a lot to do with the challenges for building such networks. The obvious disadvantage is that, well, you need to know where your communication partner is. You need to align your antennas, and if they're not aligned, you can't communicate. On the other hand, it really changes what wireless networks look like, because typically at lower frequencies, one of the hardest things is interference. And whatever, frequency assignment between different cells and intercell interference coordination, all these kind of things. Now, here, if you have these very directional beamforming antennas, a lot of that, at least in theory, goes away. You can have a lot of these links in parallel, and if the propagation actually looks like as I've drawn it very nicely, you can imagine that you can have several of these links in parallel without them interfering at all, at least in theory. The way this is achieved, the way you achieve these very directional links is, for example, through such phased arrays. I've put a little photo here what it looks like. So basically that's electronic beam steering. You have little phase shifters in front of antenna elements, and what they basically do is that the signal sort of adds constructively in one direction and destructively in other directions, and then you get such a beam forming. So now the challenge is, the path loss is very high. I mean, it scales with the frequency, and at these very high frequencies, the path loss is extremely high. Even worse, most materials block the signal completely. And what this means is, on the one hand side, it's nice because, again, reuse becomes trivial, right? I mean, one very hard thing for lower frequency networks is you have a lot of access points, you need to coordinate them. Now, at millimeter wave frequencies, what you can do is you put one access point per room, and since the signal does not leave the room because a wall would completely block the signal, then access points in different rooms are completely independent. They can use the same frequencies, they can beamform in whatever direction without causing interference and so on, so that is nice. But on the other hand, sort of if you want coverage in complex environments, because of this property, it's very hard to achieve. You need very high access point densities to actually make that work. So communication is primarily line of sight. As mentioned before, directional antennas need to be aligned, so there needs to be an alignment protocol. And also the whole RF design is much, much harder at these frequencies. So overall what we have is that, well, if the millimeter wave links are there, fantastic. They give you a very high rate and they allow very high spatial reuse, but they're brittle and break easily. So how do we design fast and reliable and low latency networks with this technology? So what you need is very fast beam training, so very fast alignment of those beams, because sure, if the link is there and you have gigabit rates, fantastic, but if it takes you like a long time to actually establish the link, and you have dynamics and want to switch between different devices and so on, then of course that overhead has to be sufficiently low so that you don't waste all the time searching rather than communicating. Same thing, since these outages, at least in dynamic networks, for example, you have people walking around, people block the signal. Now you can, of course, recover, right? If somebody blocks the signal because the access point in a certain direction, okay, you switch to a different access point, but you have to detect that very quickly to be able to react. Ideally, not just detect it, ideally you would like to predict that and then prevent that in the first place from happening. And then you have to be able to switch very fast. So you want devices with multiple antenna arrays, because one antenna array might be in a direction that just sort of, you don't have any connectivity there because with your body you're blocking the signal. You want multiple alternative millimeter wave paths. For example, in one direction, again, you have a blockage, but in a different direction, you can bounce the signal off a wall and still be able to communicate. And also what's going to become very important is that's in many cases, not a standalone technology. So it very nicely complements other technologies in a sense that it's very high rate, but providing ubiquitous coverage is hard. So it's always nice to have a low frequency network as a backup that you can fall back to in case you're just not able to establish a millimeter wave link. Now all of this is doable, and of course, again, the key point here is you have to not just be able to do it, but be able to do it very fast and without excessive overhead, because of that characteristics of the technology. There's going to be a lot of small cells, very frequent handovers. At the same time, the data rates you're dealing with are gigabit rates, right? So basically, if you've shipped all your traffic to one access point, but now you quickly need to hand over to another because that one's blocked, well, how do you get the data from there to the other one, and so on? So there are a lot of interesting problems with that. So now towards the more concrete things. One of the big problems we had when starting out was that it was just very difficult to do experimental research because you did not have good research platforms. At that point in time, the first devices were just supposed to start to come out. We didn't have them yet. And what the communications people were using, like signal generators and signal analyzers, that was not something that we could really use for the networking kind of research that we wanted to do. When the first devices came out, a lot of effort went into making them usable for research. So that's a photo of the very first router. It's a normal Wi-Fi router like you probably have at home, but it supports millimeter wave. So that's the very first device that came out that fully supports the Wi-Fi standard. And so what we did in joint work with TU Darmstadt is basically open it up, have an embedded Linux running on it, which is the later Linux distribution, so that we can modify the higher layers of the protocol stack, and hack the firmware of the millimeter wave interface so that we can modify the lower layers of the protocol stack, and especially, for example, how this beam alignment works to be able to modify it and do our research on that platform. So in the end now what we have is a Linux running on it. We can run this access point also in client mode. We can run it as a monitor, and that allows to build sort of large network topologies with many, many devices, because fortunately those are very cheap. So you can build large topologies and actually look at networking problems. And one of the things, for example, we did was try to improve the beam training, the beam alignment. What you see here in the middle is examples of what the antenna patterns actually look like. What you can see is they're not quite as nice as I've shown on the very first slide. Ideally, you would really like them to be very directional. In reality, they're not at all. So they have these very weird shapes. But okay, what you would see is that, can you see the mouse pointer? No. What you would see is that, okay, if you want to communicate in this direction around 30 degrees, then the first pattern has a nice gain in that direction, or a bit more than 30 degrees. And so what the standard device does is it just tries out all the possible beam patterns and then picks the one that works best. Brute force, but very robust and very, very simple. Now, there's a known way of how to do this in a more efficient way, called like taking ideas from compressive sensing. The idea is basically that you don't have to try all the beam patterns to figure out which one is the best or which one's the direction the signal is coming from. What you can look at is the SNR that you receive with a few beam patterns that you trained. For example, if the direction of your communication partner is along the horizontal axis in the 0 degree direction, then if you see in a relatively small SNR, then a relatively large SNR, and an even larger SNR with those three beam patterns, then most likely the direction is actually 0 degree, because that matches exactly what you'd expect after trying those three beam patterns, right? So basically then if you try a certain number of patterns, you don't need to try all possible ones. You can infer with much fewer training steps at which direction your communication partner is. Now, the thing here was that we were able to actually implement that on those off-the-shelf routers. So that was sort of the first thing where the protocol itself, the idea itself is not from us, but being able to instrument off-the-shelf hardware to just modify how the whole beam training works, that was a big step and showed that we can actually sort of use this as a useful research platform. And we were able to show that, okay, with this you can reduce the training time it takes to establish a link by a factor of more than 2. Now, after you've established a link, of course you need to maintain a link. Now, traditionally what you would do is just after a while you retrain. And of course the training takes some time. Even if you do these improvements, the time is not negligible. In very dynamic scenarios, you'd much rather sort of continuously track how positions of devices are changing, how you need to adapt your beam training. For this, we had an idea to do that basically on a per packet basis. What you can do with these devices is you can generate arbitrary beam patterns. You can generate a beam pattern that has 2 lobes instead of, like typically you want 1 lobe that has a high gain in the intended direction. If you want to know if you rotate it, what we did was generate beam patterns that have 2 lobes, one to the right, one to the left, And they have a phase shift between those two lobes. Now, if you transmit your preamble first with a normal beam pattern, and then the second part of the preamble you transmit with this two-lobe beam pattern, then if you shift it to one side, you don't have a phase shift. If you shift to the other side, then you do see a phase shift in the preamble. So that allows you, on a per packet basis, to see if your communication partner moved without having to do this full beam training again. So for very dynamic scenarios, that would allow you to sort of continuously track what's happening with your link. Now, to try this out, we had to work with a different kind of system that was not feasible to implement because we can't change the signal processing on these off-the-shelf routers. We had to work with a different kind of system that's really a signal generator and oscilloscope and these phased antenna arrays that do the beamforming. And so we implemented this on that system and were able to show that this actually allows to track device rotation in real time, and you don't need to do any beam training. In the ideal case, you don't need to do any beam training at all after you've captured the link for the first time. So what this shows is that here over time, we've rotated a device as a person moving would rotate a device. What we see in red is in black. What we see in black is the actual rotation. What we see in blue is the tracked rotation with our method. It doesn't always perfectly work, but it's always within the width of the antenna, which means that you can always continue communicating. Now, one very important property of millimeter wave channels is that they're quasi-optical, which means that typically you have a line of sight path, unless it's blocked, the direct link between you and the access point. And then you have a few other paths that are reflected paths. For example, you might have a signal bouncing off the floor, you might have a signal bouncing off the ceiling and maybe one of the walls. But it's directly related to the geometry, right? So if you know where the wall is, you point your antenna towards the wall, you know exactly at which angle it's going to be reflected and so on. So inherently, knowing about position of devices, knowing about your environment helps you a lot. For example, of course, if you know the position of the two communication devices, you don't need to do beam training, you can just point your beam in the direction that you know. If you know where walls are, you know where you can find a possible reflection for an alternative path. If you know where your obstacles are, you know whether a link might be blocked or not, and so on. So intuitively, position helps. So what we try to do is build location systems, millimeter wave location systems, that you can then use to optimize your networking. You inherently get angle information from the system itself. When you do the beam training, you're looking where your communication partner is. Once you establish the link, that gives you an angle, that gives you the angle of your communication partner. And now basically, if you have two access points, they communicate with the device, you know where the access points are, you know the angles, then it's trivial, you can just triangulate and know where the device is located. You don't even need multiple access points because you have reflections in a room. So if you have a line of sight path and you have one reflected path and you know the room geometry, again, it's something where if you look at the angles at the device at which you receive the signal, you can pinpoint yourself inside of the room. So that's nice and very useful, but typically you don't know the room geometry and you don't know the location of the access points, or at least sort of providing that information would be manual overhead that you would much rather avoid. I'm not going to go into the details of how the algorithm itself works, but we basically managed to build a location system that works only on angle difference information. So you have no room geometry, you know nothing about where the walls are, you know nothing about where the access points are, and of course, You don't know what the device itself is. That's exactly what you want to know. And the only thing that you observe at the device is what it gets from the beam training in any case. It gets the angle differences in its own local coordinate system between the different access points that it sees. And now you're trying to build a location system out of purely angle information. And we built the system. This is actually doable. At first we were wondering if it's actually feasible, and it is. The trick is what you need is movement. If you have it as a one-shot problem, it's unsolvable. But if you look at mobility and a client at different positions, and you see how the angles between access points change, after a while you can figure out what the access point positions most likely are. You can iterate over what the access point positions are and what then the client position is. And if you do that long enough and you figured out where the access points and where the client are, you can infer where the walls are. So you have unknown access point locations, unknown floor plan, only angle information. And it turns out you can build a very accurate location system with that. We compared our system, which is shown in blue here, which has sort of on a mean error of around 20 centimeters, against two other well-known approaches based on triangulation and so on. The other approaches assume you know the floor plan and the access point positions. Our approach doesn't, and still we vastly outperform those other approaches. And then, as mentioned before, you can use it also for SLAM, for simultaneous location and mapping. So here, this is what we see in the lower part, where over time, as the device moves through a room, those little black dots that you can hopefully see more or less, this is where estimated reflections are. And after a while, then you can figure out where walls are in your environment and so on. And this helps a lot. Because that tells you, for example, if you've moved and your location system told you that you moved and you know where a wall is and you know that a certain access point direction is blocked, you can beamform towards that wall at the right angle to then hit an access point to establish communication. Like a preview briefly on work that is appearing soon, like at the Mobicom conference later this year in October. Now what we actually managed to get to work is fully custom beamforming on these off-the-shelf devices. We're very happy with that. One of the very hard things is that current devices just have a number of pre-configured beam patterns, like the examples I showed on one of the previous slides. So you can do different ways of figuring out which is the best beam pattern to use, but those devices just use a fixed set of patterns, and that's just what there is. Ideally, what you would much rather do is do actual channel estimation, figure out what's the best beam pattern for the current channel environment, and then use that beam pattern rather than just the best pre-configured one there is. And we managed to get this to work on those off-the-shelf routers. And the very hard part is how do you actually do channel state estimation. Why this is hard, again, I won't have the time, unfortunately, to go into the details. The problems are a bit complex, so it has to do that multiple transmissions from those devices are not phase coherent, right? So if you want to measure phase between two different transmissions, the problem is that the phase offset between those transmissions is random. So, but at the same time, you need multiple measurements to actually measure the channel because you only have a single RF chain at those devices. And so we found a way how to actually get this to work. And we're able to then implement, on the one hand side, an actual channel state measurement mechanism on these off-the-shelf routers, and then use our custom beam patterns on these routers. And this makes a huge difference. What we see is that on average we can improve SNR. Now, on the other hand, one has to say that those routers, first generation, they didn't try very hard to optimize them, right? So also the vendor could have done a better job, but they were good enough. But it goes to show that the hardware was actually not that bad. They just didn't do a very good job of using it. So with this measuring the CSI and then using our custom beam patterns, we got a 2.5 times higher SNR on average than what you saw with the beam patterns from those routers, a factor of 2 in throughput. And that's for the average case, even simple cases where you already just have a very simple line of sight link, which is already very good. Where it really made a massive difference is in non-line of sight cases, right? So if you have to bounce your signal off at a specific angle from a wall, and you have to have a beam pattern that actually exactly goes in that direction, then very often the pre-configured beam patterns don't work very well, and you just don't have connectivity. But with our approach, you're able to provide coverage in a lot of cases where without that, you can't provide coverage. Now, what we're currently working on is to design a wideband millimeter wave software-defined radio system. Again, it's something where there's just very, very little good experimental hardware out there. We've pushed those off-the-shelf devices very far, and they're great to have because then you're really working with hardware that is the quality that you get in consumer devices, with all the problems that you get with consumer devices and so on. But on the other hand, sometimes you really need to touch the physical layer. And for that, what we're currently working on, which is quite a large effort, is take a very big FPGA that can actually generate these extremely high rates that you have for millimeter wave systems, take phased antenna arrays, connect them to up converters, and then have a full bandwidth system on an FPGA that is compliant with these off-the-shelf, or compatible with these off-the-shelf devices, and that allows us then to fully flexibly modify the physical layer. There's a lot of other work that we're doing, which I'm not going to go into details, but there are problems on really all the layers of the protocol stack, from resource allocation, MAC layer, packet aggregation, because unless you send large chunks of data, your whole MAC is just going to be way too inefficient. TCP has huge problems dealing with the rate variations that you see, right? A millimeter wave link, gigabits are there, then they're gone, then they appear again, and then they're gone again, and the transport protocol is supposed to adapt to that. Very, very challenging. And then you'd like to have lower layer technology running at the same time, as you need to switch between those and so on. So there are a lot of very, very interesting problems. So with that, let me conclude. So it's an extremely promising area, and it's just the start. I mean, that's what's currently sort of becoming feasible. There's a huge interest in 5G to use that. For local area networks, you already have that technology. You can already buy that. But it's really just the start, and it's clearly that in the coming years we're going to go up to even higher frequencies. You really need to rethink a little bit your network architecture, just because your links change so much, and that's nice because that means there's something in it for everyone. If you're doing routing, there are interesting routing problems. If you're doing transport, there are interesting transport problems. Single links are reasonably well understood, but then if you really want a fast and reliable overall network out of this, there are a lot of interesting research problems left open. With that, let me conclude. Thanks. I'm curious about your talk. I've not found. Yep. Ah, right. So the question is, why is the constellation order so low? This is only 4 QAM, QPSK. And that's these are the things that are currently being used actually to achieve those gigabit rates. So this is something where At lower frequencies, you really have to work hard. You have 256 QAM and so on just to get up to a few hundred megabits. The current routers are using that. They have 16 QAM implemented, but typically the MCSs aren't even used because it's higher than what the router CPU can sustain in terms of throughput. So the 2 gigabits that the router delivers, that is that MCS. Which also shows that there's a huge margin, right? So with this, you get 2 gigabits, but doing 64 QAM is not a problem at all. And like tens of gigabits would be easily achievable for such systems.
So a quick follow-up on that. Is it a single carrier system or is it OFDM?
It's single carrier. So okay. OFDM is standardized as well. But again, for simplicity, so far, and there's not much frequency selectivity, but so for simplicity, they're using single carrier, and again, it's something where there's a huge room for improvement.
So can I have so I wanted to ask you a bit on, I'm just trying to get up to speed on where we are on millimeter wave in terms of state of the art. So is it the case that the millimeter wave IC technology is not very good yet to be able to drive OFDM envelope, for instance? Is that the reason why?
No, it's more a matter of demand. So it's something where the chipsets are there, you could easily do OFDM as well, the vendors know how to do it, and it's really just something where it's a marketing decision.
Right.
Consumer
Thank you very
demand
much.
isn't there yet.
Are we ready? We solved it. So the second speaker of the session is Lozano, I guess. You can pronounce it properly, in fact. He's a professor of information and communication technologies at Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Angel received his PhD from Stanford. Then he went to Bell Labs. He's been an adjunct associate professor at Columbia, and he's also a fellow of Sorry for this. Got it? Otherwise, we'll do with this.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks for inviting me. I guess it's fitting that I'm the final speaker, since I'm a communication theoretician, so a bit of an outsider here in this crowd of networking experts. Okay. So just as a general comment, well, the presentation has 3 short parts. I won't be talking about Wi-Fi, but rather focus on wide area networks that can be accessed anywhere. Wi-Fi is a great complement, and we need it, but it's kind of spotty and unpredictable, and we've all had our share of frustration with it. So I'm a bit of a history freak, and as such, I think that history helps us understand the way, why things are the way they are, in this case, networks. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes going over what I consider to be the 5 major breakthroughs in the evolution of wireless communications. This was actually a very good exercise when I prepared my ERC proposal. So in my opinion, the first breakthrough came in the 1860s when Maxwell unified magnetism and electricity into this wonderful set of equations. I spent some time at Edinburgh, at Maxwell's alma mater, so I got to walk literally over these equations every morning on the way to my office. So these equations predicted the existence of EM waves, which were then demonstrated by Henry Hertz, who famously stated that he did not think that these wireless waves he had discovered would have any practical applications. Of course, he wouldn't have been more wrong, and by the turn of the century, people had set out to transmit information at a distance using these waves, initially just Morse signals. Arguably, the first to succeed was the Russian Alexander Popov, but the 2 people that history remembers are the eccentric genius Nikola Tesla and the more entrepreneurial Guglielmo Marconi. So Marconi was not just a resourceful engineer, but a shrewd businessman who capitalized on his inventions to form a small empire in the form of the Marconi Corporation, which for years monopolized the ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore communication. And the Marconi company and the wireless technology itself jumped to fame in 1912 when the Titanic sank, and the distress Morse transmission from the Titanic was picked up by the Carpathia, another ship, which managed to rescue 700 people. So these are recreations of the Marconi room aboard the Titanic from the famous movie. More signals gave way to amplitude modulation, and by the 1930s, we had frequency modulation. This is one of the early car phone prototypes, as you can see up here. It was very big, but a real wonder back then. And after World War II, 25 US cities deployed public telephone systems for car phones, which consisted of a single transmitter blasting power from the highest location. Capacity was very lousy. Typical waiting times were half an hour just to get online. And in this context, this fellow Douglas Ring had a transformational idea, which was to take a certain region and divide it into small parcels, which he called cells. And rather than have a single transmitter cover the entire region, have small individual transmitters covering each specific cell. So he illustrated this concept with this picture, which is kind of hard to see, but it depicts the city of New York and the coast of New Jersey. And he proposed to parcel it into these cells. So in time, this would be called a cellular system. It was a visionary idea, but the technology to implement it just didn't exist in 1946. Okay, number 4, so there are places and times that are special, and Bell Labs in the middle of the 20th century was one of these places and one of these times. And just 2 years after Ring planted the seed for cellular networks, information theory was born, in fact, not far from his office. So this made it possible for the first time to quantify information with the bit as a universal currency and to determine the amount of information that can be sent reliably through a noisy channel. So in a very real sense, the information age began with Shannon's work in 1948. Final breakthrough, to me, is the realization of a comment made by Richard Feynman that there's plenty of room at the bottom. And the offspring of this comment was the integrated circuit with companies like Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel and TI, which made it happen in the 1960s. And Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, famously observed the progression of integration of transistors over time, which has driven processors and memory to these days. So these 5 breakthroughs set the stage for the first generation of cell networks, which were trialed by AT&T in 1978 in Chicago, Newark. This is some paperwork from these original trials. Each consisted of a bunch of cells, which are shown here as hexagons. And this gentleman is Martin Cooper, the guy who designed the very first handheld phone and made the first call. And then commercial service began in 1983. So following Ring's vision, this first generation of systems were organized in cells. Each consisted of a base station connected by radio with the users in the cell, and then all these base stations cabled into a network. And then as users move from cell to cell, the calls are just handed off. So this first generation was followed by 2G, then 3G, now 4G, and pretty soon 5G, writing Moore's law to increase capacity and bit rates dramatically, but I would say arguably without any major conceptual breakthroughs. So one way to gauge the evolution of performance over time is to look at the product of 3 terms. The first would be the spectrum efficiency in bits per second per hertz per cell. The second would be the cell density, so number of cells per unit area. This is the reciprocal of the cell size. And the third term would be the bandwidth. So when you multiply these 3 terms, you get something called the area capacity in bits per second per unit area. Okay? This is a very important quantifier of performance. And it was this very same gentleman, Martin Cooper, who observed at some point that the area capacity has roughly doubled every 30 months or so. So sometimes that's called Cooper's law. And if we, and this compounds into a factor of about 1 million up to today. And if we break down this factor of 1 million into factors, we observe that the lion's share, which is a factor of about 1600, corresponds to just increasing the cell density. Okay? And then there are smaller factors associated with having more bandwidth. That would be a factor of 25, and having higher spectrum efficiency, factor of 10. There's a factor of 2.5 that's associated with other minor improvements. So these numbers are just ballpark numbers, but I think they're very informative. Nothing beats densifying the cell structure when it comes to increasing the area capacity. And indeed, I think Ring would be amazed if he saw how far his idea of cells has actually gone. So by now, there are over 400,000 cells in the US alone, and over 6 million worldwide, roughly 1 cell for every 1,000 people on the planet. Okay, so certainly a successful idea if there was ever one. So using this breakdown that I showed before for the area capacity and the fact that every cell services about 1,000 people, we can actually calibrate what today's networks can deliver. So a 4G network has a spectrum efficiency of about 1 bit per second per hertz per cell, okay, averaged over all locations. Every cell serves, like I said, about 1,000 users. And there's on the order of 500 megahertz of licensed spectrum worldwide. It's a bit higher by now, but for this exercise, this is good enough. So you multiply these, we get 500 kilobits per second per user. Okay? Now, only a subset of us are active at any given time, so we actually get to enjoy a few megabits per second. Okay? It's a huge improvement over the 10 kilobits per second that was a peak rate about 20 years ago. Now, I couldn't detail all the advances that had taken us from 1G to 4G, but I'm just going to touch briefly on the one that's been my main research topic, which is MIMO, multiple input, multiple output, which consists of a vectorization of the transmissions. So rather than sending a single signal from a single antenna, we send a vector of signals from various antennas, say this vector X over here. Each entry will be a signal sent from one of the antennas. If the receiver also has multiple antennas, then what we observe can be construed as another vector, Y, and the channel connecting these various antennas at one side and on the other side will be a matrix, H. So by inverting H at the receiver, we can recover the transmit vector of signals from the observations. Obviously, it's not so simple because the observations are noisy. That's this vector N here will be the noise. But with substantial encoding and signal processing, we can indeed recover the transmit vector from the receiver observations. So this is MIMO in a nutshell, and our smartphones are running it as we speak. So with all that we have already, which is, like I said, a few megabits per second for each of us on a good day, do we still need another generation? Do we still need another generation? Well, apparently yes, because the demand for data is unstoppable. So it's growing 57% a year right now, which compounds into an order of magnitude every 5 years or so. We already surpassed the 16 exabytes per month, which is a very big number for radio access. And some years ago, I co-wrote this paper with people from Samsung, Huawei, Nokia, and some other universities on 5G, which has had substantial impact. So in this paper, we outlined the 3 directions of evolution that 5G has taken, which drive to the limit some existing mechanisms. So first, the number of antennas used for MIMO, it's made huge in this so-called massive MIMO. Then the densification becomes ultra-densification. And then the frontiers of usable spectrum are pushed very aggressively. And this is what Jörg covered in his presentation. So let me briefly comment on each of these directions. So in massive MIMO, the idea is to go from today's tower top base station deployments, where we can house maybe a dozen antennas or so, and move to completely new deployments, which would be installed on the rooftops or facades of buildings, each one with possibly tens or hundreds of antennas. Antennas that would have to be camouflaged as urban elements, not to disturb the environment. So, for instance, China Mobile is experimenting with these tiles, antennas that look like tiles, or also commercial signs, so that they're not very visible. So that's the idea of massive MIMO. There's some prototypes already out there. Here at top, we can see a 64 antenna prototype from Alcatel-Lucent, now part of Nokia. And then below, we have a 128 antenna prototype, array prototype that came out of a European project. So that's one direction, to equip big cells with massive MIMO arrays. The other direction is to have many, many, many small cells. Okay? And new terms are being coined to refer to these small cells. We've gone from macro cells to micro, to pico, to femto. Somehow we skip nano. I don't know why, but never mind. And now we're down to cells of a few tens of meters. So that's the second direction. The third direction, which is what Jörg covered, is expanding the range of frequencies. Okay? So this chart shows the attenuation as a function of frequency. Attenuation in dB. So typically, we've been stuck in this box, in this window that ranges between a few hundred megahertz and 5-6 gigahertz. So below this range, the antennas are just too big, and above it, there's too much attenuation. You can see how it spikes up. And like Jörg explained, propagation is just very lousy. There's no diffraction around corners. It's very directional. But now, with ultra-densification, signals don't have to go very far, right? Because the cells are tiny. So there is hope that we may be able to tap frequencies up to 70, 80, maybe even 90 gigahertz. I think the jury is still out on how well we'll be able to communicate at these frequencies. But certainly the expectations are indeed very, very high. Okay, so this is why 5G is shaping up to be. So big cells with massive MIMO plus many small cells using wider bandwidths. Now let me, in this third part, touch on to the ideas that underpin my ERC grant, achieving the idea of having networks without cells. So despite all this great progress, the structure of the radio access networks today, even for 5G, is not very different from the ones we had 20 years ago. The idea of the cell is still at the heart of everything. And there's an inherent problem with cells, which is interference. So when we send a signal to a user, because of the nature of radio propagation, that signal doesn't just reach this user, it also reaches every other user in every other cell. Okay? So for all these other users, these unintended signals are interference, which adds to their background noise. Now, when you think about it, what is interference really? Interference is not noise, because it carries information. Interference is a signal intended for a user that's being picked up by another user in another cell. Okay? So it's determined by the cell structure, which is an artificial construct. So Perhaps, uh-oh. Sorry about that. It's certainly an exciting presentation. Okay, so let's see, where was I? Yes, interference is determined by the cell structure. So maybe we should start moving past the idea of a cell. So the idea of a cell has served us very well for a long time, but by now it may have run its course. So maybe we should start seeing the network as what it truly is, which is a set of base stations talking to a set of users. Okay? And rather than have each base station just communicate with the users in itself, we should try to have all the base stations communicate with all the users at the same time, together. Okay? And that can be done by vectorizing the transmissions across multiple base stations. So take this toy setting with 2 base stations and 2 users. So traditionally, each direct signal between one base and one user is intended signal, and the crosslinks are interference, okay? So every user cares only about what's coming from its base station, doesn't care about what's coming from the other base station, okay? Now, if we pre-code the transmissions, if we vectorize the transmission for both base stations, then every user cares about both transmissions, okay? The crosslinks stop being interference, and now they become useful signal, okay? That's the idea. Obviously, it's very easy to draw on this very simple setting with just 2 bases. When you look at the whole network with hundreds of thousands of base stations, you cannot possibly vectorize all the transmissions at once. So you have to carefully define local neighborhoods where the vectorization takes place. Moreover, this has to be very dynamic. So we have to have a certain vectorization structure at a given frequency and a given time. Then at a different frequency, or as users have moved around, need a different vectorization structure, and so on and so forth, okay? This is very challenging, but now we have the horsepower to do it. This idea of vectorizing multiple base station transmissions also goes hand in hand with other current lines of thought, chiefly with the idea of taking all the processors that reside at the base stations and pulling them together into a cloud, okay? Leaving at the edge of the network just these small units containing an antenna and an amplifier, okay? It's just small radio units. When you get this, you obtain what's called a cloud radio access network, which is a very fashionable concept. So taking this idea to the limit, what we would have is the entire baseband processing in the cloud. And at the edge of the network, just all these, lots and lots of these tiny radio units, okay? So the structure of the network, as far as the radio access is concerned, is no longer determined by prefix cells, but rather is software defined, okay? Completely flexible. This is very powerful because no resources have to be idle, and especially because any future upgrades come in the form of a software update. Okay? So if and when the time comes to move from 5G to 6G, rather than send technicians to every base station to replace hardware, we can just hit the button and upgrade the system just like an operating system. Okay? So that's what we're working on in my ERC grant. Cloud-based, ultra-dense networks with no cells, trying to help the next push forward in wireless access. And I'm going to finish this accidented presentation with a quote from Marconi. He said this in 1932, shortly before he died. And I think that if he could see how far we've gone since then, he would be very proud. So thank you very much.
Thank you for dealing with all these problems. So we have time for a couple of questions. We're a little bit late, but I think we can take.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. So before we have, no, now we have interference, and with no cells we'll have signals that we're not interested in, right? So we will receive our own signal plus signals that we don't have any interest on. So how this can be more efficient?
No, the point is that all the signals you receive, you have interest in. So your information will be spread through all those signals, right? So today, your information comes from one signal, and the rest of the signals contain information meant for other users, right? So the idea is to have every transmission will contain information for different users, right? And then you have to get your share, right? So you care about a portion of what comes from every signal. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, so there's a part that you are receiving that you do not care about, so it's like what before was interference.
Well, that's where the signal processing comes in, right?
Okay.
So the signal processing has to reject what you don't need and just accept what you need.
Okay.
Right? It's non-trivial, but essentially it's a matrix and vector problem. So it's.
But so what I mean is that will that be always more efficient than?
Yeah, sure. It is much better, definitely. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I think it's just a follow-up question on similar, actually. So is the challenge a synchronization challenge, or is it a processing challenge? And are there sort of, off the top of your head, are there similarities with what people in broadcast have done before in MISO systems, for instance, where you're sort of receiving transmission from multiple towers on the same frequency?
Yeah, synchronization is a problem. So in today's MIMO transmissions, all these signals come from the same base station. So it's easy to synchronize them. Now, when you have different base stations, transmit the signals together to the same user, right? Synchronization can be a problem. So you have a certain delay tolerance beyond which you start having problems. So this is one of the challenges, definitely. Now, with OFDM, is actually fairly doable because what you send are very narrow signals in frequency, right? You send all these subcarriers. So the very narrow in frequencies are very long in time. So it gives you a lot of tolerance. It's okay. But certainly, bases that are very far from each other, the problem is not so much the synchronization, which you can achieve, it's the time of flight. So if the time of flight is very different, right? So one base is very close, the other one is very far. It's going to be a few microseconds of difference because of the propagation. And eventually, this becomes a problem. But what tends to happen is that as you get farther away and you get desynchronized, you get also attenuated. And then your contribution is weighted very little for this particular user because you're very far. So even if you're asynchronous, it's not a big problem. So in that sense, that helps you. The power decay over distance helps you with the synchronization. So the people that are very far are asynchronous, but they're far, so they don't matter. And the ones that are close, the ones that matter the most, are synchronous because of proximity. So that, in that sense, is actually quite benign. Yes. Probably the subcarrier spacing will have to be adjusted, right? That's what you mean, probably, yes. Yes. So in fact, in 5G, something very nice is that they have multiple subcarrier spacings, so you can actually choose the one you want. It used to be a single one, now it's actually a whole bunch of them. So that's a very nice feature of 5G.
Okay. Thank you. I think let's thank the speaker again. And I don't know if we are going to have the mini break or we move directly to the panel.
Basically, so the purpose of mini break is just to set up for the panel. I think volunteers now will take few tables and rotate them so that our panelists can come forward. Also, some of the panelists will be leaving to the airport soon, so we just have informal discussions with some informal statements by the panelists, and then we'll go as long as we want, but no longer than 6 p.m. So at 6 p.m. we'll definitely close the workshop, but yes, so just rotate it. Maybe the question for the audience, I'm not sure how we're going to do taping, so maybe we just stop video recording and streaming altogether. Camera is facing me, panelists will be there, and maybe not, taping the recording make people more comfortable and open-minded. I think one more is probably enough, right? Or...
It's okay.
Okay, well, maybe one, just in case, one more.
Okay.